Walter Carl Becker. You likely know him, hopefully you like him too. Before his tragic passing in 2017, he was one half of the band that I will probably never shut up about, Steely Dan. His other half, Donald Fagen, is definitely the more well-known of the two since he's the band's frontman and lead vocalist, along with the fact that his solo works have received lots of praise from critics and general audiences alike, with some fans considering his 1982 classic The Nightfly and occasionally his 1993 album Kamakiriad as unofficial entries in the main Steely Dan discography. But what about Walter? He's usually seen in the public eye as the quiet and reserved one of the duo, even though it seems to be quite the opposite as shown by several interviews and promotional materials, including the now infamous Steely Dan Confessions video.
That's fascism.
On top of this, Becker's solo efforts never really reached the same level of popularity as Fagen's, which is what I'm talking about today. In this video, I'm going to talk about Walter Becker's solo career and give my thoughts on his two albums, 1994's 11 Tracks of Whack and 2008's Circus Money. Now before I get started here, I would like to clarify that I am not a music critic, nor do I really know much about music in general, so just be aware that pretty much everything said in this video is coming from the perspective of an average or possibly even below average listener. Feel free to berate me in the comments. With all of that out of the way, let's just get right into it. Walter's solo story begins not too long after the release of Steely Dan's 1980 masterpiece, Gaucho. The production was incredibly rough, and Walter was probably hit the hardest. Not only was a severe drug problem finally catching up to him, but also his then-girlfriend Karen Stanley passed away due to an overdose, with Becker facing both grief from her death along with legal charges from her family, as well as the fact that he got hit by a speeding cab in the spring of 1980, leaving him bedridden and unable to work in the studio. In 1981, Steely Dan had broken up, with Walter deciding to move to Hawaii, where he would take control of his drug habit and eventually start a family. While his former partner Donald Fagen was busy recording The Nightfly and writing songs for other artists, Becker decided to take it easy for a while and became, quote, a gentleman avocado rancher and a self-styled critic of the contemporary scene, unquote. Walter did eventually get back into the music business, primarily as a producer, producing albums such as China Crisis's 1985 album Flaunt the Imperfection, and most famously, Ricky Lee Jones' 1989 album Flying Cowboys. While Becker and Fagen professionally remained apart for most of the 80s, they both played on Rosie Vella's 1986 debut album Zazu, and around that time, they collaborated on a song titled Snowbound, which would eventually appear on Fagen's 1993 album Kamakiriad, which Becker had helped produce. That same year as Kamakiriad's release, Becker and Fagen pulled the Steely Dan name out of retirement and toured to promote the album, and on said tour, Walter put out a few songs that he wrote on his own, such as Book of Liars, Cringe Maker, Fall of 92, Girlfriend, and Arlon. After the tour's conclusion, Becker went into his home studio in Maui, Hyperbolic Sound, to record some of these tracks along with a few new ones to make. So here we have 11 Tracks of Whack, released on September 27th, 1994. Before I talk about the tracks themselves, I want to take a brief moment to appreciate the album's packaging. The front cover is a pretty grainy, distorted, monochromatic photo of Becker with his name and the name of the album in a very grungy typewriter font in the top left quadrant, while the back cover is the track list in the same font next to an image of a baseball bat hitting the windshield of a car which is flipped 90 degrees. It just screams early 90s edge. Anyway, this combination of images definitely feels kind of strange and dirty almost, which is quite a far cry from the mostly clean, clear, and sleek covers of all the Steely Dan albums up to this point, especially Asia, Gaucho, and Donald Fagen's albums. In my opinion, this honestly describes the album perfectly in relation to the overall Steely Dan discography, in that 11 Tracks of Whack is not a Steely Dan album. Sure, it may have lyrics similar to that of Steely Dan, which range from a peek into the life of a loser longing to escape their loserdom, to an absurd song about an alien trying to fit into human society, along with the fact that, as a whole, this album's sound is heavily based in jazz and rock. However, this just isn't a Steely Dan album. It really just seems like a collection of songs that Walter wanted to make at the time. Probably the most telling of this is through the subject matter of the songs, which get quite personal at points. For example, with Surf and or Die, a kind of grungy and heavy song which started off as a poem about the death of a family friend in a hang gliding accident, along with practically its polar opposite, Little Kavai, which is a heartwarming hula-type tune that Walter wrote about his son. It also gets quite dark and edgy at points, especially in the second track, Junkie Girl, which describes the drug-laden lifestyle and eventual death by overdose of a young woman from the perspective of a possibly ex-boyfriend who just can't do anything about it. Walter also swears a few times. Even with all of this, the album keeps that signature Steely Dan type cynicism and irony, and as a whole, I think that this album has a running theme of failure. Whether it's something relatively serious like Junkie Girl, Book of Liars, and Cringemaker's sentiments about failed relationships, and Girlfriend in My Waterloo's examinations of the lives of lovesick losers who want to escape their loneliness but fail miserably, or something that seems pretty inconsequential like nobody wanting to sit with the uncool narrator during lunchtime and Hat Too Flat, there's at least a hint of this theme throughout basically all the songs, except one, Little Kavai. While it's not my favorite song, it's definitely the odd one out, since, as stated before, it's an incredibly wholesome song Walter wrote about his son, Kavai, which really doesn't fit in with the incredibly sardonic nature of the other tracks. This might be where the album's title comes from, since there's 12 songs, but only one of them isn't whack, being Little Kavai. 11 tracks of whack. But this theory kind of gets messed up, taking into consideration the Japanese-only bonus track Medical Science, which would make it a total of 13 tracks, along with the implication that one other track is not whack, maybe Medical Science, but does it even really matter? Who knows why it's even called 11 tracks of whack? Maybe Walter wanted to have a good laugh about the irony in that the title says that there's 11 songs, but there's actually 12. Anyway, enough of that. On to the sound of the album itself. As stated before, it carries heavy jazz and rock inflections, but also has greater blues influences than your typical Steely Dan album, along with a tinge of grunge thrown in there. It's quite an eclectic range, which really fits with its pretty distinct sounding production. Speaking of, production-wise, it really has this sort of early 90s feel like Kamakuriad, with the use of early computer sequencing.
I learned how to use a computer sequencing program that I thought would be very helpful for writing songs, and especially since I was kind of isolated from the musical community at large.
And it may not be a surprise to know that Donald Fagen played keyboards and helped Becker produce this album. It was also mixed by sound engineers Roger Nichols and Dave Russell, with the former being Fagen and Becker's go-to sound engineer since Can't Buy a Thrill, and the latter eventually going on to help Steely Dan produce Two Against Nature a few years later. As a result, like Kamakuriad and basically every other Steely Dan related album, the songs are so re-listenable since they have lots of subtle elements that you don't catch until a re-listen. Like, I was listening to this album again for this video, and it blew my mind when I heard this really subtle horn in the right channel during the chorus of Hat Too Flat. Anyway, unlike Kamakuriad at all, many of the 11 tracks of Whack have this demo-like quality to them as a result of the production, which may be a turnoff for some people who enjoy more organic sounds, but to me, it only adds to the charm. Even though I like that sort of dated sound, it kind of works against it sometimes, especially with the weaker songs My Waterloo and This Moody Bastard. Of course, that's not to say there aren't great, more natural instrumental moments, because there are, such as the somber yet soulful sax solo in Book of Liars performed by Bob Shepard, the horn section of Heart of Case, pretty much the entirety of both Surf and or Die and Cringemaker, notably with guitarist Dean Parks playing on and writing the latter, and the solo guitars in Little Kavai. Not to mention, Walter Becker does his signature guitar noodling throughout the entire thing, which fits in well with both the more rough-sounding and more developed parts of each song. Anyway, now it's time to talk about the Walter Becker in the room. Walter Becker's lead vocals. They're great, and I like them. Becker's voice has this very grizzled and unhappy, yet still really soft quality to it, which honestly fits these songs perfectly, since the narrators in many of them seem like they have cynical and jaded views of the world around them, but at the same time, you can tell that they're still very tender people. Couple that with the music, and you have yourself some sharp and rough, yet still very soft tunes that are just really nice to listen to, and all in all, 11 Tracks of Whack is a brilliant album that shows the world how the other half of Steely Dan plays, and I gotta say, he plays it pretty well. 14 years after the wacky tracks, the legendary Steely Dan man brings us Circus Money. Like its predecessor, it definitely feels like a collection of songs that Walter wanted to make. While it does retain more jazz, rock, and blues elements, along with more sardonic and edgy subject matter, Circus Money does away with the dated 90s production and in exchange picks up a more reggae-influenced sound. Also, unlike 11 Tracks of Whack, Donald Fagen is not present at all on this one. Rather, Becker enlisted Larry Klein to help produce Circus Money and also co-write every song except the title track. In general, it's a pretty different album, and it's immediately shown by the cover art, which features a half recreation of a 19th century Yupik mask on an almost completely black background. The story behind its creation and usage is an interesting and complicated one involving the Smithsonian Museum and one of their department's accusations of cultural appropriation, along with the hiring of a clay artist and an intense amount of photo manipulation, as recounted by D-Mod of Walter Becker Media as part of a Walter Becker University lecture. I'll leave the whole article in the description if you want to read it. It's pretty interesting, I think. Anyway, the point here I'm trying to make is that Circus Money is a lot more slick, dark, and strange compared to its predecessor. First, the subject matter. While it feels less personal, it's much grittier and more cynical, which goes to show that Becker was the one who brought the edge to Steely Dan. Gamblers, crumbling affairs, grief and reminiscence, running away from accountability, sudden loss, a seedy carnival from the perspective of a child, pathetic pickup artist sugar daddies, promiscuous women, egotistical alcoholics with no self-control, toxic relationships, superficial movie stars, Chalk Miller and Jimmy Fish, it's all here. Of course, these songs, while they are pretty straightforward for the most part, are a bit cryptic and vague, and are littered with metaphors, symbolism, name drops, and archaic vocabulary, which leaves them wide open to interpretation. I think the album comes to a head at Dark Horse Dub, the odd track out, which was only included in the international release of Circus Money. It tells the incredibly vague story of the aforementioned Chalk Miller with its lack of lyrics, but it has a whole set of unsung words which were posted by Walter Becker Media in 2018 alongside an upload of the song. They don't really do much to clear the air, but at the same time, I think it's better that way, since it's just a really confusing song. The way it's structured and sounds just doesn't really feel like anything else on the album, and combined with the unusual lyrics, Dark Horse Dub just makes for a really perplexing experience. A good summary of the album as a whole. Anyway, the main thing I love about these songs is that while they are a lot more dark, gritty, debaucherous, and pessimistic, they still feel like a very natural extension of the stories that 11 Tracks of Whack was trying to tell. I think that Becker himself really describes it best in the accompanying essay of this album. Quote, "Put the bundle dead on the nose of the aforementioned nag, not the old ball and chain, the other one, the four-legged one, and set off into an astonishingly singular continuation of an up till then unremarkable lifetime of endeavors underbaked then abandoned, enterprises flailed and forgotten, dreams discarded, tips and rumors dished, hopes dashed, omens misread, disaster courted, bedded and boned till dawn, and the etc. particulars of unsorted wreckage and miscellaneous debris scattered about, as is often the case with such men and such lives." Unquote. Speaking of how Walter himself says it, Walter's soothing yet rough lead vocals work really well here with the lyrics, though rather than portraying mostly gold-hearted cynics like in 11 Tracks of Whack, Becker's voice takes on a slew of sardonic and gritty contexts and fits them all perfectly. Take Selfish Gene for example, which is the song about the sugar daddy slash pickup artist. Becker's voice's soft side lulls you into the seemingly sweet and generous Selfish Gene, and his more rough tone kicks in when you realize that Selfish Gene is a superficial asshole. It's honestly brilliant. Anyway, on to the sound. Compared to 11 Tracks of Whack, it's a lot more developed and clean, in that many session players and members of Steely Dan's touring band at the time were recruited to record it. The instrument choice is also incredibly wide, especially with the guitars, which Becker, Dean Parks, and John Harrington do a great job with in creating the sort of weird but chill atmosphere that the album has, keyboards, as well as other one-off instruments such as the drum machine in the beginning of Downtown Cannon and that Calliope-type instrument used in the intro of Selfish Gene. Every song does something different with them, whether that be through the mixing or filters or what have you, and the variety never really feels overbearing. The production is also just really good and clean, as any Steely Dan related release should be. As a result, it's less polarizing to listeners in this department at least, since it's a lot more natural and sounds like it was finished, but that's not to say that Circus Money hasn't split the fan base. As mentioned previously, the album is heavily influenced by reggae, with most of the songs having a slower groove with a plethora of reggae chords, which may be a turnoff for some people accustomed to Steely Dan's usual jazz, rock, pop sort of sound. Not me though. In my opinion, Circus Money is one of the best Steely Dan related albums. Its very wide instrument choice, combined with the use of slower, soothing grooves and an array of jazz, rock, blues, and reggae chords, along with Walter Becker's soft yet grizzled voice which fits the jadedness and cynicism of the album perfectly, as well as masterfully complex production, makes Circus Money an otherworldly experience. It's honestly unprecedented in the greater Steely Dan universe, which I think is a good way to describe Walter's solo works as a whole, but it especially applies to Circus Money. It's really something else, and it speaks for itself. Circus Money is a testament to Becker's brilliance in songwriting and his ability to make some damn good music. Walter Carl Becker tragically passed away on September 3, 2017 after a battle with a severe form of esophageal cancer. He was 67 years old. While Becker may no longer be with us, his legacy still lives on in the phenomenal music he created, both with Donald Fagen as Steely Dan and on his own. Though Walter only left us with 2 solo albums, this selection is honestly quite perfect in my eyes. Sure, it would have been nice to have more Becker music, but at the same time, 11 tracks of Whack and Circus Money show a perfect range of Walter's abilities. Jazzy, bluesy, reggae, heavy, soft, clean, smooth, under and overdeveloped, these 2 albums have a near perfect dichotomy between them. And as much as I'd love to go in depth on every song on these albums, I really don't think I should, not only because I wouldn't be able to do them enough justice, and I think it's just better to see them as their whole albums, but also because they honestly just speak for themselves. While, of course, Walter is unable to make new music, that's not to say that there isn't any new content coming from his estate. Well, new isn't really the right word to use here, more like previously unreleased. Before his passing, Walter arranged to have some of his demos and other unreleased material released through his intellectual/creative property trustee, DMod, who is the primary manager and moderator of Walter Becker Media. Since its formation in early 2018, Walter Becker Media has released a plethora of interesting rarities, from unfinished songs and outtakes to live recordings to home videos. It's definitely worth checking out, not only because they serve as a good peek into Walter's personal life and his creative process, along with the fact that the content is overall pretty enjoyable, but also because it serves as a reminder that Walter Becker was a musician who had so much to give. As long as someone out there is enjoying his stuff, Walter Becker lives. So that was a kinda deep, kinda brief look into Walter Becker's escapades as a solo artist. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it inspires you to listen to Becker's incredible solo work if you haven't done so already. Also, before I end here, I would like to apologize for the incredible lack of content these past few months. I've been too busy being a nasty university boy with no place to go and shitposting on Twitter, and I just haven't had the time to focus on YouTube, so I hope you can forgive me. I also hope that this video didn't seem like a complete mess, and at the very least, you found some entertainment out of it. As for what's next, I do have a few good ideas already written out to some extent, some Steely Dan related, some not, so I hope you stay tuned for those when I eventually get around to making them. If you like this video and want to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you have any more details you want to add, agree or disagree, or have any suggestions for zany and or silly music stuff that I can talk about, let me know in the comments. Anyway, I hope you're doing well, and I hope to see you again in the next one.